start speaking in Portuguese, then you're going to move to... Okay? Pessoal, boa tarde. A gente vai estar falando aqui, a nossa mesa é Construindo modelos de acesso a novas tecnologias. E então a gente vai, como a gente tem dois convidados da língua inglesa, Brad ele tem um tradutor simultâneo super já moderno, então está tudo melhor. Mas a gente vai fazer em inglês e as coisas, se ficar... o Matheus vai falar em português e a gente vai, se necessário, vai colocando os pontos críticos de cada discussão, né? Então, o que a gente vai fazer aqui é o seguinte, cada pessoa vai se apresentar e vai falar 15 minutos sobre essa parte de criação de modelo de acesso a novas tecnologias. E aí depois a gente pode as pessoas podem perguntar, vocês podem perguntar, qualquer pessoa pode fazer qualquer pergunta e a gente trabalha em cima da pergunta. Então eu vou começar com Brad. Brad, so is building models to have access to new technologies. This is the main topic. So I think we can start with you and you can give your presentation. And then, so the idea is to have each of us have 15 minutes. And then after all the presentations, we can open the questions. Huh? We can, they will ask questions and we can answer them to give some discussion, okay? So let's start with you, Brad. And primeiro I'll thank all of you being here, but I'm speaking Portuguese just for them to know, okay? Primeiro quero agradecer a presença de vocês aqui, deles da mesa, um prazer enorme estar com todo mundo aqui. Eu vou até já começar a fazer minhas correções sobre a inovação, sobre a incorporação aqui mesmo, mas a gente vai começar com o Brad, depois a gente segue para a Noha, depois a gente vai seguir, fala Vanessa, fala Matheus, eu falo um pouco também. A gente começa com o Brad. Brad.
Great to be here in Rio, and I spent the last 2 days learning about the Brazilian healthcare system, and what has struck me is how we're all trying to address the same problems through very similar tools, but with some different challenges based on how our health systems are designed, but some very similar challenges. I found myself nodding along in a lot of presentations thinking, yes, yeah, we see that. So it's great to be here, great to hear how you're tackling some of those, and I have some ideas I'm taking back with me, if that's okay. So I just wanted to share a bit in terms of my background. I've worked at NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, for about 5 years now, and before that at the National Health Service for England, so the national body for the NHS. And my primary responsibility has been around managed access agreements and the commercial negotiations that go on alongside some of the data collections that we have in England. But just to give a bit of context in terms of the number of evaluations we're doing in the UK, every year NICE typically will evaluate around 100 drugs. Of those drugs, around 90% are recommended with a commercial access agreement or a simple patient access scheme. I'll describe those in a bit more detail later on, but the upshot really is that we're really fortunate with the process we have in the UK, where we can get the licensing and the HTA recommendation quite close to each other, and we also, before we publish the HTA recommendation, ensure there's a commercial agreement in place so that patients can have access as soon as the recommendation is published. So we sometimes hold up the process at NICE a little bit to allow those commercial negotiations to run on. But the idea is that once NICE makes a recommendation, patients should have access at that same point as well. Around 10% of the recommendations from NICE have some form of commercial. Went off? Ah. Yes. So I was saying around 10% of recommendations are made with some sort of innovative commercial deal. Typically, that might be a managed access agreement, which is a recommendation for patients to have access while further data is collected so that NICE can then reevaluate the drug. And typically, maybe one or two of those may actually be some sort of complex, maybe outcome-based or other complicated commercial arrangement, usually designed to address a specific issue with either the clinical effectiveness data that we're seeing or something to do with the risk of not necessarily achieving the value or recognizing the value of that treatment within the health system. So these mechanisms exist in the UK, but we don't use them very often. And I was going to explain a bit about why we do it that way. But since 2016, we've recommended 24 ATMPs. We've evaluated 24. Only one of those has had a negative recommendation so far. But we have seen companies withdraw 6 of them during the evaluation process, which I think is an important consideration to bear in your mind when you are thinking about putting in place complex commercial arrangements, is that for ATMPs, we have seen a much higher withdrawal and failure rate in clinical studies than we have for previous technology classes as well. So it's something at NICE that we keep in mind in terms of how we approach this, that we do wait until we've seen enough promise before we jump into the negotiations to start designing quite complex arrangements. And we've seen 17 treatments recommended with access, but only a few of those, 5 or 6, have actually required some sort of commercial flexibility. So putting it in context where we see NICE making recommendations on the whole, using simple discounts or simple commercial arrangements, when it comes to ATMPs, we're seeing a similar approach is working for the majority of ATMPs, but for some, there may be particular reasons to do something different. Part of the reason for the caution that we have in the UK is some of the early attempts at commercial flexibility really weren't very successful. So things like free stock or the cap on a cycle or dose cap, we found really difficult to implement because we were having to process a financial transaction but collect additional clinical information to do that, and we couldn't bring the two together. But with the introduction of the Cancer Drugs Fund in 2016, we've had much greater capability to be able to link the financial data with the clinical outcome data and start doing some much more interesting things. So the managed access approach that we use in England is an example of how we've done that. And we've seen around 80 technologies go through managed access alone. Again, only a small proportion of those would have had some sort of innovative commercial arrangement. And it was really with the introduction of the CAR-Ts that we saw the advent of properly outcome-based, complex commercial arrangements where we were taking both the financial and the clinical data and linking them together in a way that we hadn't before. I guess the key message in all of this, though, is that simple is preferred because we spend £3 million a year just to transact these deals. That's £3 million each year to transact fewer than 10 commercial arrangements because we need the people to collect the data, we need the people to validate the financial information, we then need to work with industry, the companies whose commercial agreements they are, to check whether they agree that the data that we've collected is correct. So it is quite a labor-intensive process. So if you find a way to do it more efficiently, please let me know. we would love to do this more efficiently. And we're assuming that there are potentials, or there is potential with AI and other computing software that this could get easier in the future. But at the moment, the way we're working, this really is quite a challenge to do in a streamlined way. I think one of the other key things that we've learnt as well in the UK is the importance of the partnerships between NICE and NHS England with industry. So when we are thinking about commercial arrangements as part of a NICE process, a lot of companies are surprised when I tell them this. You should come to NICE a year or two before your submission is due and talk to us. Because if we need to put in place a commercial arrangement that is quite complicated, it's going to take up to 12 months to design that process. So coming early and explaining the needs for a complex arrangement really does help us think about what data might we need to start collecting now. What would we do if this was recommended and there was a lot of uncertainty and we did need a complex commercial arrangement? And just to think about how we might manage the risks between the company and the NHS as well. Because NICE is responsible for making a part of the decision where we assess whether a drug is cost effective, but NHS England then has to determine whether or not it can afford to pay for that drug. So we have slightly different mandates and we need both organisations to align. So in coming early to NICE, we can signal to NHS England where we think a complex commercial arrangement is going to be either requested or required, and then hand over to NHS England to start those considerations. But it's not easy to convince NHS England that they need to do something different because they know how complicated this can be. So that's some of the context for how we approach the innovative arrangements. I think one of the things that we sometimes fail to convey is even in these innovative arrangements, a simple discount is at the heart of everything we do. So we always require companies in England to come to us by setting a list price first, then setting a patient access scheme, which is a fancy word for saying, give us a simple discount. So give us your list price and then a discount off that, and then we'll consider whether that's cost effective. And then throughout the NICE evaluation process, that discount may change, it may increase. And what we're aiming to do is to get to plausible cost effectiveness with a simple discount. The objective of doing anything more creative or anything more innovative over and above that is really then to think about what is the risk share. So step one is to get to plausible cost effectiveness. Step two is then to work out how can we come up with something that trades the uncertainty that we're seeing, especially around some of the ATMPs that have come to market recently with high price tags and a lot of uncertainty, and using that to kind of anchor the complex arrangement in something simple to start with. Another reason for doing the simple transactions or the simple discounts in the heart of our transactions is our financial processes are done at the lowest or the most local level possible. So where the patient gets treatment, they'll process the transaction. They can't actually handle anything other than a simple discount. So the hospital that's treating the patient will see the simple discount and will transact with the company at the simple discount. And then the outcome-based part or the complex element will be transacted nationally. And this is another example of where we have to work quite closely with industry because we're effectively asking industry to accrue quite a large amount of money that they're going to have to pay back to the NHS at some point in the future. So we pay up front for a higher price and then we ask for a refund later on once we know what the outcome for that patient has been. And sometimes, as you can imagine, those outcomes aren't for 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So we're having to accrue these amounts of money over multiple years, which can be a challenge for companies. We haven't found a way in England to do annualized payments. It's been requested a lot, but one of the, I've been hearing a lot about how your constitution shapes your health system, and one of the ways that our constitution shapes our health system is that we have a principle where one parliament can't bind the hands of a future parliament, so we can't accrue liabilities now that a future government may have to pay for. So we have to balance our books every financial year, which is why we typically will pay companies more and then get a refund later, because that's one way we can handle that financial flow. I know I've mentioned resource slightly, but what I haven't spoken about is the data. So managed access is primarily focused on data collection to reduce uncertainty. And that's usually through a commercial arrangement plus a data collection arrangement. And we're really lucky in the UK to have really good national data systems. But we're finding increasingly, especially for rare diseases, we don't have the disease registries in place to collect the data. So we're having to work, again, quite closely with companies and asking them to invest up front in some of the data collection that is needed for particular diseases. And for some diseases like spinal muscular atrophy, where we've seen a number of indications come through in recent years, we've worked collaboratively with several companies to actually build that patient registry and for them to share the cost between them and to all get the benefit of the data that's being collected. Because one of the things that we do push quite firmly for in the UK is to have the data collected within the NHS. When we've seen companies or third parties collecting that data, it often misses key elements, or the opportunity to combine that data with other NHS data sets is lost because of the privacy concerns around how we use that data. So if we collect the data in the NHS, we can use it then to link patients across different data systems and follow them through these different processes. So as I've mentioned, there are a few limitations that we come up against. The upfront payment is one where we require we need to pay the company first so that we can get a rebate. But the risk assessment for outcome-based arrangements especially is so precarious for the NHS that there's an insistence that we collect 100% of data for 100% of the patients who are participating in the schemes, which is a really high burden because it's really uncommon for databases to collect 100% of the data 100% of the time. So we're having to find ways to be quite creative with how we collect the data. So we insist that all data that's being collected for innovative arrangements is data that we would otherwise collect for patients, or it's collected as part of a routine health assessment. So using the spinal muscular atrophy example, patients would come in for a set of assessments every 6 months. We would use that opportunity to collect their clinical data, but also the patient outcome data, the carer outcome data, and try and get a full picture of the utility of the family with the child of that condition, but also the child's clinical outcomes. So trying to ensure that we've got enough resource in place to do all of that in a 3 or 4 hour clinic session is quite important as well. And having the infrastructure in place to do that too is really useful. Another element that we've seen in the UK is to ensure that only eligible patients are being treated. I heard in a session this morning that it's possible for patients in Brazil to get access to treatments that maybe they're not indicated for. Whereas in the UK, we have quite strict policies, and the way that we do this for some of the innovative arrangements, especially for treatments that are over £1 million per administration, we have national clinical panels. So doctors will fill in a form and refer their patient to the national clinical panel for assessment, and that panel will then confirm whether or not that patient is actually eligible for the treatment. And for some conditions, that's quite a finely balanced determination, because some of the clinical considerations may be difficult to decide based on the information at hand. So there is sometimes a backwards and forwards. So just because a patient has been referred doesn't mean that they'll necessarily get access. But where they don't get access, there has to be a good reason, and that has to be communicated back to the clinician to understand why their patient will or won't get access. I think one of the best case studies of having done this recently in the UK is for I've forgotten the company's name, but Hemgenix, the gene therapy for haemophilia B, where we saw really promising data on the benefits of the infusion for patients whose haemophilia was uncontrolled. And what was quite apparent early on in that appraisal was that the value of further data was going to be important. For the NICE process, the clinical trial was actually going to collect that data eventually. They just need another 5 or 6 years to do it. But for the commercial arrangement, we needed to collect real-world data alongside that clinical trial to be able to have the data available that we would need, because obviously the clinical trial was blinded. We couldn't identify which patients were receiving those treatments, whereas in the real-world context, we could actually identify those patients and follow them through. So having that real-world database was key to us being able to do this outcome-based arrangement with the company on that occasion. It's fair to say that the company actually didn't want an outcome-based arrangement in that place. It was the NHS that pushed for it instead. So it's the first time we've seen in the UK the NHS has actually said we'd rather some form of outcome-based arrangement. But I guess the one thing that I mentioned at the start that I wanted to kind of finish on is, although we have done these innovative arrangements in the UK, and we do now have the infrastructure and mechanisms to do it, because we're finding that the volume of ATMPs coming through that are being recommended is less than we expected. We're seeing them tail off sometimes in clinical development. We're having fewer and fewer requests for us to do these innovative arrangements, and whereas it was previously companies pushing for it, we're now seeing the health system actually asking for it instead. So it's just an interesting observation to notice that the positions of both industry and the NHS have shifted, whereas at first the NHS was really resistant to doing this. They're now actually the ones who are proposing some of these more complex arrangements in the first case. And I'll finish there.
Thanks, Brad. I think we can wait for until the end to have the questions, probably. Okay? Huh? Okay. So Noah, I think you can be the next one. You can introduce yourself and talk about what you're doing today.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Nelson. First of all, it's really wonderful to be with such distinguished panelists and to be here in Rio, so thank you so much for this opportunity. Just as a quick introduction, I'm Noha Salem. I lead Global Women's Health Policy at Organon. And Organon is a women's health company. We're a global company with a focus on women's health very broadly. And traditionally, when you think about women's health, you would think about sexual reproductive health. But the way we look at women's health is diseases that impact women uniquely, differently, and disproportionately, which broadens the definition. And maybe what I'll do today is maybe share some reflections from our journey, which is almost 5 years, and maybe some ideas and thoughts around how would the system be gender responsive, if I can say so, in a way that prioritizes and acknowledges the unique needs in the women's health space. So women's health is not a niche area. We are half of the world's population. We're taking care of the other half. And so I think that's reason for us to also take pause and reflect and understand how is the system right now maybe serving or causing some of the challenges for existing portfolios, but ultimately to the R&D ecosystem. I think post-COVID, we've seen a bit of a revolution, greater understanding of what the gaps are, where some of the unmet needs are, the investment case, which is very compelling. If we close the women's health gap, we unlock $1 trillion of GDP by 2040, which is incredible. We've also deep dived into what are the 10 critical diseases that are causing this burden, and we know who they are. And the reason that this burden continues is the lack of R&D. And so it's no surprise that also only 1% of all R&D goes into women's health, excluding women's health cancers. So, the way we would look at this from a, and it's really a great opportunity to share the industry, private sector perspective based on, our experience in the markets, and then ultimately how that translates to global strategy, but also feeds into the broader ecosystem. So the way we would think about this is, for example, more downstream and upstream. Downstream being how are we registering, evaluating, and commercializing products in the markets. And we can give a few examples of, for example, registration. If let's say we are in a country where women's health is recognized as a priority, we typically see that that links into the regulatory process and an acceleration of some sort. So the presence of a policy, political will and support and recognition is the first step that we see acts as a catalyzer in the system. The second is looking at HTA processes. How are these products evaluated? And typically, obviously, HTA bodies play a really critical role in the ecosystem of reimbursement and evaluation. Our position is, as we're evaluating specific technologies, taking a holistic approach around direct, indirect, and also societal impact, which is so critical to women's health as well. So can we challenge ourselves to recognize the full spectrum of value that is unlocked with women's health products? And then how does that also then link into some of the regulatory processes? So, once a product is registered, as we invest in lifecycle management, additional indications, for example, how are these two connected? Can we create some sort of linkage or reliance of some sort? For example, here in Brazil, there is technology horizon scanning, which is fantastic. How can we strengthen and solidify that connection between the evaluation and ultimately accelerating registrations as well? And then, we talk about reimbursement and access. And I think this is actually when you have the conversations for the upstream part, which is why isn't there more investment? Why aren't there more assets that are being developed? It actually goes back to that point. How big is the size of the market? And if there is no support in terms of coverage, reimbursement, that kind of feeds back into that vicious cycle of not enough investment being put into this space. So it's again, Brazil is such a fantastic example of prioritization, recognition of the value that women's health can bring to society, to the economy, with the recent expansion of SRHR and the basket of choices with the addition of the single rod implant, and thinking about how we work together, public and private, to not just introduce a technology, but also ensure that the system is really prepared from a healthcare system strengthening, capacity building, training, awareness and education. So back to the upstream piece, if we do want to address the I would say chronic challenge of more investment needed, the continuous support and I would say cross-sectoral collaboration across the multiple players to challenge ourselves to think about how do we bring more women into clinical trials? How should clinical trials be designed? Do we want to get creative around endpoints? And these are really critical components that are really connected to ultimately how the women's health space will evolve in the future. And this is something that no one sector can really do alone. And I think it's been wonderful to see, the Women's Health Coalition under the World Economic Forum come together, bring kind of the key actors in the space to really disrupt the system and start to think, what do we need to do differently to ensure that, the system ultimately leads to more investments there. And the industry definitely plays a critical role in really sharing that real world experience that I was talking about downstream, so that ultimately the system is developed in a way that results in impact. And I know we're going to go into questions later on, but I can maybe pause here.
Como é que ela vai seguir? Como é que ela vai acompanhar?
Inglês mesmo? A gente vai seguir falando em inglês, tá? Qualquer coisa a gente troca.
So, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Vanessa Teich. I'm the Director of Oncology Transformation at Einstein Hospital. And, I'll try to bring a broader perspective considering public and private systems in Brazil about access to technology. And I think we have a big challenge from the start because we have tried to get a system. Well, we've been inspired by the NHS when we built our public healthcare system, but with a much larger population and less money. So this is a real challenge because and on the other hand, and I think Matheus will talk about that, we're pricing innovation based on the prices of international countries that invest in healthcare much more than we do. So, of course, that leads to more restriction. And so I'll try to separate my talk here between the public system and the private system. In the public system, I think we need to link better the decision of reimbursement to the funds we have, so to the budget we have for example, drug expenditure. Because today, and I think maybe, that's a question I have then for Brad about how the NHS and NICE deal with that. But the thing is that we have a defined budget to spend on drugs in the public system. But the decision about reimbursement doesn't take that budget into account. There's a health technology assessment process, and in the end, CONITAC can make a decision, for example, yes, we recommend the reimbursement, but without specifically knowing that we have the money to purchase that drug. So what's happening in practice is that we have many drugs that have received a positive recommendation from CONITAC and haven't been purchased. So patients are really not accessing the drugs. So health technology assessment is not the final step. The final step is finding the money to purchase the drugs. And that's where I think we have to change the way we evaluate this. So I think we have to first evaluate how much money we have for new technologies. And I know that's hard because although we have a fixed budget, there are some extra monies that come from parliament funds, for example. But let's treat that as a bonus, under my view. So let's consider that the minimum we have to incorporate new drugs is the budget we have minus the expenditure we already plan to do with the drugs we are already reimbursing. And that will lead to an amount of money we have to reimburse new technologies in that year. And then we will need a way to prioritize better. I think that's something we still don't do very well. That is, we have a lot of technologies that could be reimbursed, and that's my personal opinion. We don't have a clear definition of the priorities aligned to where we want to go with the health system for our population. So if we have those priorities and we have the amount of money that we can spend, then we can start to negotiate with the industry for the prices and criteria for reimbursement. And then we come to the models, and we try to pursue, for example, risk-sharing agreements. But what I think is that we have started with the most complex models, outcomes-based. Because when we do risk-sharing, it doesn't mean we'll spend less. It means we'll reduce a type of uncertainty. So if we have epidemiological uncertainty, and we do because our data on epidemiology is not perfect in Brazil, then we could say, let's do a cap on the budget. And then I'm sure that this is the maximum money I'm going to spend with that drug. Maybe we could start with that. Oh, we have uncertainty about the duration of treatment. And I heard you said that, cap on duration is not easy to control. We haven't tried that, but that could be an idea. And finally, I have uncertainty about outcomes, and usually we do. And then we go to outcomes-based agreement. But I don't think that should be the first option because it's really, really hard to follow. And it depends on the structure of the centers as well to follow patients. At Einstein, we have coordinated a study that had been funded by the Ministry of Health for us to follow patients with spinal muscular atrophy when we were trying to incorporate Spinraza, nusinersen, in the public system. It ended up not being incorporated and reimbursed, but we included 10 centers, reference centers in Brazil to treat patients. And we got requests from the center saying, are you going to send physiotherapists for us to evaluate the patients? Because we don't have them. And we said, but you're a reference center for that disease. Yeah, but we don't have the structure enough to follow all patients. So how could we get the data? And it's very, very complex. So I think we're starting with things that will be expensive for us to implement. And maybe we could start with simpler, let's call it, models that would minimize our risk of overspending, considering we have a fixed budget. So that would be kind of my recommendation or ideas for the public system. In the private system, I think it's even more complex because it's so heterogeneous. We don't have one single private system in Brazil. We have 800 different payers with very different sizes. For some of them, the cost of one gene therapy is more than what they get out of premiums in a year. So then I think we could pursue two different approaches, and maybe Mateus could comment on that, which is having a price for incorporation in the private system, because we don't really negotiate the prices when we incorporate in the private system, and then finding a way to fund those technologies. But this is something that has been discussed, tried, but not very hard, I think, which is to create a common fund between the payers where everybody would put money, and the payment for the very expensive technologies, such as advanced therapies, could come from that specific fund. Or additionally, which would be very, I think, disruptive, but maybe having those advanced technologies that are very expensive, all funded, all purchased by the public system, but co-funded between public and private. It's similar to what we do, not exactly like we do, but we have, for example, for transplants, we have one single waiting list, and patients go into the same waiting list because they have to wait for the organ, so it's different, but then they are treated with the procedure in the public or the private. But the view of the need or the demand is unique in the country. Maybe it could be an idea for the private, but I think for the private, it's even more complex to think of alternative payment models. And that's my contribution. I think it's enough. We can then go to the questions and after Mateus.
Oi. Alô? Boa tarde. Eu sou Matheus Amâncio. Estou secretário executivo da Câmara de Regulação do Mercado de Medicamentos. E nessa mesa eu estou com uma mesa... CEMED. E nessa mesa eu estou substituindo a Daniela Marreco, que era a antiga secretária executiva, atualmente é diretora da Anvisa, mas teve um problema na voz, então ontem me pediu para vir substituir. Vou até pedir desculpa aos outros palestrantes por estar falando em português, mas como até a minha presença aqui foi um pouco inesperada, falar inglês seria um desafio um pouco a mais. Mas agradeço muito o convite e é um prazer estar nessa mesa discutindo um tema tão importante como esse, que é como garantir o acesso da população a novas tecnologias de saúde, especialmente a medicamentos inovadores. E é até engraçado, mas vindo para cá, eu peguei um Uber, né? E papo vai, papo vem, eu converso muito com o Uber. Ela mencionou que ela estava esperando, ela tem doença de Crohn, e estava esperando a decisão judicial para ela ter acesso, né, ao ustekinumab. E ela tinha opiniões muito fortes, né? Falou que isso era um assassinato, enfim. Então foi curioso mesmo, que vindo para essa mesa eu tive um exemplo real de como esse tema impacta a vida das pessoas, né? Então, eu vou fazer a minha fala no sentido de falar de acesso a medicamentos do ponto de vista da jornada do medicamento. Então, vou passar pelos diferentes pontos, né, desde o PED até, finalmente, a incorporação, claro, dando destaque à parte da precificação, que é o que é parte do meu trabalho na CEMED. Então, o acesso é um desafio no mundo inteiro, tanto em países ricos quanto em países de desenvolvimento, como é o caso do Brasil. É uma cadeia complexa que começa lá no PID. Se fosse resumir PID em poucas palavras, acho que seria caro, complexo e arriscado. É caro porque o desenvolvimento de uma nova molécula pode chegar, às vezes, a $1 bilhão. É complexo porque, às vezes, esse processo leva de 10 a 15 anos. E é arriscado porque às vezes, menos de 10% dos produtos chegam à fase 3. E os que chegam à fase 3, às vezes, menos da metade têm resultados favoráveis. Nisso é natural que a indústria crie estratégias de proteção, né, como patente, exclusividade comercial, preços diferenciados, proteção de dólar, proteção de dados, perdão. Do ponto de vista da indústria, o objetivo é equilibrar a inovação e o retorno financeiro, que todo aquele investimento dedicado naquela pesquisa tenha um retorno, de fato, para poder garantir a sustentabilidade da empresa. Daí nós chegamos no segundo ponto, que é a pesquisa clínica. O Brasil está entre os 20 países onde mais acontecem pesquisas clínicas no mundo, mas ainda assim a nossa participação é de cerca de 2%. É uma participação muito parecida com a nossa participação no mercado de medicamentos global, né? Que é cerca de 2% também. E nós temos potencial de crescer muito. E as novas legislações aprovadas nos últimos 2 anos colocam o Brasil um pouco em sintonia com esses modelos internacionais de estudos clínicos mais complexos. E aqui eu cito a Lei 14.874, de 2004, e o Decreto 12.651, de 2025, que buscaram justamente trazer mais modernidade, mais flexibilidade, mais rapidez também para esses estudos, para a condução desses estudos no país. Passada a parte dos estudos clínicos, dos ensaios clínicos, a gente chega finalmente ao registro sanitário, que no Brasil é feito pela Anvisa. Nesse ponto, a Anvisa está pensando em segurança, eficácia e qualidade daquele medicamento, seguindo padrões internacionais de qualidade. Ainda assim, o registro, uma vez que o medicamento tem o registro aprovado, isso não é garantia do acesso. É apenas a primeira etapa que aquele medicamento sobrevivente do PED, sobrevivente dos estudos clínicos, precisa cumprir. A outra etapa é, finalmente, na Câmara de Regulação dos Mercados de Medicamentos, que é a precificação. Na CEMED, a gente avalia o quê? Vai avaliar se esse medicamento ele é inovador, de fato, quais comparadores nós podemos usar para poder compará-lo e definir o preço, qual o benefício clínico comprovado daquele medicamento e qual é o preço desse medicamento em uma cesta de países selecionados que nós usamos para poder definir o preço. A CEMED ela tem uma resolução, a regra de preços da CEMED ela existe desde 2004 e está passando por um processo de revisão, justamente porque a gente compreende que o mercado de medicamentos ele é extremamente inovador, então, em 20 anos, muita coisa aconteceu e a resolução precisa acompanhar esse desenvolvimento. Então, nessa nova resolução, nós vamos trazer novas categorias de produtos, justamente trazendo mais foco e maior liberdade para que a inovação aconteça dentro do país e, principalmente, para que a inovação ela seja remunerada. Então, nós teremos categorias de medicamentos com inovação incremental e também de biosimilares, né, que é uma categoria que, hoje em dia, ela não entra em nenhuma regra específica da CEMED. Ela é tratada como um caso omisso e acaba sendo um processo de precificação um pouco mais demorado e que cria algumas distorções de mercado. Então, a nossa expectativa é que, de fato, essa nova regra de preços saia muito em breve, possivelmente dentro desse ano, e que ela permita maior inovação, traga maior modernidade para o mercado de medicamentos no Brasil. Então, da mesma forma que o registro ele não garante o acesso, a precificação, ainda que que o resultado seja um preço acessível, ela não garante que o medicamento vai ser incorporado. Então, a última etapa, né, seria a incorporação do medicamento, que é a decisão final e é o ponto-chave que vai definir se o sistema de saúde vai ou não pagar por aquela tecnologia. No SUS, quem faz esse trabalho é a Conitec, e no setor de saúde suplementar é a Agência Nacional de Saúde Suplementar, a ANS. Na etapa de incorporação já são outras preocupações, a efetividade e a segurança do medicamento em condições reais. Então, a Conitec vai avaliar toda essa questão de custo, efetividade, o impacto orçamentário do medicamento para o governo, as alternativas disponíveis e a evidência epistemológica daquela doença. Então, assim como a CEMED tem que equilibrar sustentabilidade da indústria, inovação e acesso, na etapa de incorporação é necessário equilibrar um equilíbrio ético e financeiro e social, né? Porque levar o medicamento a um grupo sem que outro grupo seja desassistido. Nisso eu vou citar algumas tendências internacionais que já foram até citadas aqui pelos outros palestrantes da mesa. São os contratos de risco compartilhado, onde o pagamento daquela terapia, né, daquele medicamento, vai depender dos resultados, contratos por performance também estão surgindo ao redor do mundo, onde o pagamento depende se o medicamento vai funcionar ou não. E no Brasil, trouxe um exemplo muito bom aqui, que eu acho que a gente fez o primeiro mais complexo, né? Seria esse acordo de desempenho, que aconteceu no caso do Zolgensma, uma terapia gênica para atrofia muscular espinhal, incorporada ao SUS. Por muito tempo foi o medicamento mais caro do Brasil. Hoje em dia ele tem um preço médio de 7 milhões. Ainda é bem caro, mas não é mais o mais caro. Onde se fez um acordo vinculado ao desempenho dessa terapia gênica por 5 anos. Então, aqueles pacientes que eles foram tratados, eles são monitorados por 5 anos, o que também gera um custo para poder acompanhar esse paciente, levar uma equipe que vai dedicar a esse acompanhamento. E o pagamento ele acontece acontece em etapas. 40% na infusão, 20% após 24 meses, caso tenha tido resultados favoráveis, 20% depois de 36 meses, últimos 20% depois de 48 meses. Então, o Brasil ele tem se modernizado, tentado se modernizar nesse sentido, tanto em todas as etapas, né, tanto em termos de registro do medicamento, tentando possibilitar a entrada de novas terapias, novos medicamentos no Brasil, quanto à precificação, vem passando por um processo de renovação para poder permitir a inovação, permitir a entrada de novos medicamentos no país, de garantir essa sustentabilidade da indústria dentro do Brasil. Mas, ainda assim, é um tema complexo, né? É um tema em que a gente está tentando equilibrar muitos pratos aqui de uma vez. A gente tenta equilibrar a inovação, tenta equilibrar a equidade e a própria sustentabilidade do sistema. Eu acho que é um termo que aparece muito quando a gente fala de medicamentos, principalmente de precificação, é preço justo, né? Mas o que é um preço justo? É justo para quem? É justo para a indústria, que ela fez a inovação, correu risco, fez toda uma série de investimentos para garantir que aquele medicamento entre no Brasil? É justo para o paciente, que às vezes não consegue pagar por aquela terapia, enfim, tem que recorrer à judicialização e outros caminhos? É justo para o sistema de saúde, que tem um gasto crescente com a incorporação de medicamentos, principalmente aqueles de terapia rara e essas terapias gênicas que têm um valor mais elevado? Então, eu acho que o nosso desafio e essa mesa é muito importante por isso, né? Porque a gente tem que pensar como garantir que o medicamento chegue a quem precisa, no tempo certo, com custo razoável e com impacto real. Por isso, eu acho que espaços como esse aqui são importantes, o diálogo, principalmente, tanto entre o regulador e o setor regulado, quanto os outros elos, né? A própria Conitec, o próprio Ministério da Saúde, é importante para poder a gente entender os desafios e a complexidade que cada ente dessa cadeia complexa, mais essencial, está sujeito. Então, encerro minha fala por aqui.
Bom, I will start in Portuguese because some of the messages that have to be very clear. So it's, I think you were following with your. Até vou puxar uma conversa que a gente teve, que eu escrevi um artigo onde eu digo que a inovação ela é feita para países ricos. E aí a mensagem que pode ter sido percebida é que eu acho que o Brasil não vai correr atrás dessas inovações. E é exatamente o oposto. Então, eu sempre trago aqui para a gente ter uma ideia. Em 2023, o SUS gastou por pessoa R$ 2.400. A saúde suplementar gastou R$ 6.000. O Reino Unido, só no sistema público, gastou 21 mil. A Dinamarca, 31. Estados Unidos, 75 mil. Então, se você olhar, a saúde suplementar ela está muito mais perto do SUS do que dos países desenvolvidos. O Brasil hoje ele representa só 1,8% do gasto mundial em saúde. Então, o que eu quero dizer é o seguinte, a gente não tem força para mudar a direção de um transatlântico, mas eu tenho que conseguir incorporar o máximo que eu puder. Então, quando eu falo isso, não quer dizer que eu vou me conformar em não incorporar no Brasil. Eu, há 6 anos, quando eu estava como assessor do Ministério da Saúde, trabalhava lá com o Denis Anasquiti, eu trabalhei em 2 grandes programas, um de oncologia e um de avaliação e incorporação tecnológica. E a minha recomendação na época foi criar uma agência, hoje eu chamo de instituto, que seria um instituto de inteligência, que vai definir o que o país deve incorporar. E aí eu tenho uma opinião muito pessoal sobre isso. Eu acho que o primeiro critério que eu tenho que usar é o benefício clínico. Aí eu vou avaliar quais são as necessidades da sociedade, e a gente tem que entender que o gestor público ele tem que pensar em todas as doenças, ele não pode pensar só na mais prevalente. E ele vai ter que definir, com base nas necessidades e com base nos recursos que eu tenho hoje, o que eu vou priorizar. Né? O Brad estava falando, a gente quando fez essa discussão de desfecho clínico, de outcomes, você pegou uma doença rara, poucas pessoas, e foi uma dificuldade gigantesca. Certo? Então, a gente hoje não tem capacidade estrutural para fazer alguma coisa com volume maior, ou fazer muitas doenças raras ao mesmo tempo, onde o volume vai ser grande. Lembrar que quando você fala em doença rara, mais ou menos 5, 6% da população tem alguma. O número previsto no Brasil são 13 milhões de pessoas. Tudo bem que a gente está pensando aqui nas crianças, com doenças mais raras, tudo isso, mas tudo bem. Então, por que eu estou falando isso? O Management Agreement que a gente coloca, ele, na verdade, ele é uma forma de desconto. Se você pensar bem, todos os acordos, no fundo, são só uma forma de desconto. Essa é uma coisa que parece mais justa, porque você não paga pelo que não funciona. Dá uma sensação de justiça boa. Né? Qual é o problema prático? Aí eu vou colocar uma situação. Eu fiz o primeiro acordo de pagamento nessa modalidade no Brasil tem mais de 10 anos. Foi num medicamento oncológico. Qual é o problema prático? O primeiro, definição do que é sucesso e do que é insucesso. Isso muda radicalmente quanto você vai ter de devolução. Outro é a gente ter a capacidade de medir o que está acontecendo. Né? Então, eu só queria deixar claro, eu vou até escrever isso para completar o artigo que eu escrevi, que a minha meta hoje é incorporar o máximo que eu puder. Só que eu tenho que ter inteligência para fazer isso, eu tenho que definir as prioridades do país. E hoje eu acho que quem tem que dar esse norte é o próprio país. Porque senão ele fica à mercê de incorporações que vão acontecer por quem tem mais pressão. E eu sou totalmente a favor da indústria, quero deixar isso muito claro. Porque eu prefiro ter um problema de incorporar do que não ter o que incorporar. Só que eu tenho que ter sabedoria para decidir onde eu vou incorporar e o quê. Eu venho de uma época, a minha mãe foi operada por úlcera duodenal. Teve trombose venosa profunda, embolia pulmonar e quase morreu. Hoje ninguém opera por úlcera duodenal. Tem um estudo em doente com câncer de reto, que tem um marcador molecular específico, que com imunoterapia, 100% de resposta completa. Em 3 anos, 96% daquele grupo não tinha tido recidiva de doença naquele momento. Câncer de reto é uma doença que você vai fazer químio, radioterapia, cirurgia, pode levar a uma colostomia definitiva, um monte de problema pós-operatório. Então, e uma das dificuldades que a gente tem quando a gente discute remédio é que quanto daquele investimento do que você está pagando, isso é uma coisa importante, representa você estar pagando o caminho do futuro. mesmo que o presente não seja perfeito. Entendeu? Você não pode esquecer que quando você trava o progresso da evolução de um desenvolvimento, aí eu não estou falando só de remédio, de máquina, de device, você pode estar travando a criação de alguma coisa que no futuro vai ser extremamente útil para a sociedade. Pode ser que em alguns momentos você só vá conseguir incorporar aquilo para toda a população quando você tiver um genérico, por exemplo. Mas você tem que ter uma política que define isso. Então, aqui eu quero deixar claro aqui que eu sou totalmente a favor da inovação. Quanto mais, melhor. Me impressiona a velocidade com que as coisas estão acontecendo. E a minha função hoje é enxergar o que é mais útil para a sociedade como um todo, com o recurso financeiro que eu tenho. E dentro do recurso financeiro que eu tenho, como é que eu maximizo a minha incorporação tecnológica? Então, aqui, isso aí a gente vai escrever depois, mas é exatamente isso. E aí, Brad you have a translation, right? So we were talking about the incorporation of technologies, how we make this. Okay, so, but Brad, I would like to start. A gente vai abrir para as perguntas, mas eu vou começar com uma pergunta para o Brad, que eu acho que é importante. Brad, we know the UK is facing lots of problems with the pharma industry. Some of them leaving the country, saying they're no longer going to invest in the country because of the prices and the negotiation that is being done in the UK. Okay. So I'd like to see what you saw, what I was saying. So it's very complex and complicated to have outcomes-based agreements in Brazil. I think everywhere. It's not easy to have all this type of situation. And one thing, if you have lots of management agreements, you put all of them together, probably it's above your capacity to pay. So the problem when you do not have a lot of money is because you are not going to pay even technologies that can give you clinical benefit. If you don't have a lot of money, you have to make a decision of which of them you're going to incorporate and those you're not going to incorporate, even if they work. So it's a definition of priorities, opportunity cost, all that stuff. But I would like to know from you how you see the situation in the UK. You know, we had the Cancer Drugs Fund. So they closed for a while, then they returned because I think they underestimated the capacity to pay for new technologies. And the current situation where the UK, you see in the news that the pharma is having difficult negotiations with the country because of the way the country is negotiating with them. So I would like to know your opinion about this situation because you have to make some decisions about it, and it's not very easy to do this. But this is I really would like to know how you see this problem today.
Yeah. The answer to this question actually addresses your point as well, Vanessa. So in the UK, we have an agreement between the NHS and industry that says that we will have a voluntary scheme that companies will opt into, where the growth in health spending or drug spending is going to be increased in preset increments year on year. So we agree that every 5 years in advance, we agree what those increments are going to be. But within that scheme as well, there are then also incentives for innovation. So newer drugs have preferential treatment within that. And there are other commitments to invest in research and development, manufacturing capability. So it's a broad package to support industry, the trade-off being we will increase the drug spending budget, but that spending amount will be capped. So then when NICE and NHS England are making decisions about whether to incorporate a drug, they don't have to worry about whether it can be afforded because there's an overall cap on how much can be spent. The difficulty we've run into, though, in the UK is that process works so well that we've overspent our drug budget, and the mechanism that kicks in then is that the industry gives us a refund. So once we've already negotiated the discounts with industry, there is then an annual reconciliation, which means they refund even more to us. And this is why the issue has arisen. It's an interesting challenge because NICE's role is in the center of all of this, and we're now coming under pressure internationally and in the trade negotiations with the US to think about whether we change our thresholds to increase them. But fundamentally, unless we have more funding available for drugs, we're going to struggle to actually address the root cause, because what has happened is NICE has recommended so many drugs in the last couple of years that it's exceeded our ability to pay for them. And that's a problem that we're seeing in countries all across Europe, all across Asia, I'm sure here in Latin America as well. And where it will go, I'm not entirely sure. I think there is definitely a suggestion that NICE's thresholds will change, but that won't address it. The government's budget is happening today. I've been trying to find out whether or not I'm paying more tax next week. I think I'm probably going to be paying more tax. So I think what we really need to do in the UK is actually really question how much are we willing to pay, and if we're not willing to pay what it takes to pay for all of this, there is going to be, I think, some sort of selective prioritization for patients. Either we'll be choosing patients who have more advanced disease to treat, or we'll be focusing more on patients where there's an opportunity to prevent disease in future. I'm not sure where it's going to go, but I don't think we can just keep on increasing the health budget every year. It's unsustainable. Anyone with any solutions on how to control that?
So I happily have to move ahead with the next one. I'd like to know if you have any final comment as our guests. So, because unhappily you have to move to the other conversation and you have to finish.
No, I think I want to acknowledge also the conversation around budget impact, but then also how do you factor in the pricing policy in the conversation? We've had experience as well within VPAG, obviously, as a company that operates there. And I think there's also an opportunity to explore how do we define, or the criteria for definition for those products. For example, there was an instance around one of our, the LARC specifically, which went through an evaluation that didn't reflect its state, and therefore sometimes when the system is so rigid, right, and doesn't allow for that flexibility, it actually then is to the detriment sometimes. So, however, I think the opportunity to have this ongoing dialogue on how the system needs to evolve, how is the industry reacting to it, I think that's important. But I think the reality is across the world, not just in Brazil and in many countries, the UK and others, budgets are constrained. There are a lot of challenges there. And I think from a women's health perspective and from global health, there's even greater impact because of donor dependency. And I think we're seeing now an increased appetite for conversation around innovative and sustainable financing. And while that might not necessarily mean that you're funding the entire healthcare system, it might go towards specific programs with specific outcomes to find efficiencies in the system, ensure there's rigor, data management as well. So I think there's opportunities in times of challenges like this to think about creative solutions. I think women's health is actually one of the areas where this could be easier because there's a solid quantification of not just the health outcomes, but also the societal outcomes, where some impact investors would be really interested to put some funds there. And that could give government also more flexibility in terms of ensuring they only disperse upon achievements or outcomes. So I think, obviously learning from what has worked or evolving or refining what's been working in other places, but also exploring what has been applied in the green space, for example, in the health space is something, that could be really interesting as well.
Então, eu vou agradecer a presença de todos. I'd like to thank all of you who are here with us. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you. And talking about the UK, I think that the main driver today is not about willingness to pay, but it's capacity to pay. So we have to start with this point instead of willingness to pay. So I don't know how to do this. It's politically, it's not easy, but it's a need. Okay. Então, pessoal, agradeço a presença de vocês. Obrigado por estarem aqui. A gente vai passar para a próxima mesa. Obrigado. Thank you so much.